Catus Maximus here, this time with yet another camera teardown. Been kind of building these up. This is the Olympus X-42, 12 megapixels, 5x optical zoom, but it's definitely is cheap, very lightweight. I keep on trying to get through these as quickly as possible, but covering enough detail. It's just a long video. These cameras are pretty. These little, especially pocket cameras, are just really amazing little exercises in micro mechanics. And it's always an interesting little puzzle to take these things apart. I'll give Olympus credit because this also takes AA's, even though these cameras really rake through the AA batteries pretty quickly. They are pretty easy to replace. And you're not stuck having to wait for a battery to charge and spending a bunch of money to replace the batteries. Interestingly enough, this is one of the few cameras where the battery cover, that is too big of a screwdriver, is actually screwed on. And it's interesting, these cheaper ones really aren't designed to be repaired. A lot of wires are soldered inside them, and you can't, they're just not designed to really quote-unquote last. However, on others, like a Panasonic I recently reviewed, was really well designed. It was obviously designed to be serviceable. Even the little backup memory battery was really easy to just pop the cover off the back of the camera, slide out the top cover, and the battery was actually held in by a little plastic clip. It was really pretty amazing. With these, I always start out by just basically removing all the exterior screws. And on this Olympus, I'm suspecting this is not a serviceable camera at all. Just like the Kodak, where everything was just soldered together, and there was, just no intention of anybody ever actually going back inside it. And one of the reasons why you buy a slightly better camera. Quite a few little screws around here. These bottom ones are actually pretty tight. And I always save these screws whenever you run into a piece of electronics or maybe another camera. I was noticing how this screw is actually pulled in and dented into plastic there. That's not very good. But I do save all these little screws because they're like impossible to order, and if you ever lose one out of a camera or some other kind of device with a tiny screw, this is a great place to find them. And as far as tearing these things down, once again, it's just an interesting puzzle, particularly trying to take apart the lens assembly. Those are always real interesting. And seeing how the optical image stabilization works and that type of stuff. So we'll get all these little screws out here and see how this one comes apart. Some, like the Kodak, the front comes off, and some, or most, it's actually the back that comes off. I think I've got all the visible screws there. We'll see what. And it appears on this Olympus, it's the front that comes off. So I'm about 50-50, maybe a little bit more. But out of about the 5 or 6 cameras I've torn down so far on this channel, 2 of them, I think 2 or 3 of them, have had the front cover come off. Pretty simple here. Now I'm wondering how we get this front plate off of here, or this lens plate I should say. It isn't the most obvious. We do have a couple screws on top here holding this control board, which is holds the shutter button. Surprisingly enough, they have yellow tape over the top of this, and most of them actually don't. And I'm sorry for the background noise, have the dishwasher running. Pull out this piece of tape. See if there's any other screws hiding. And we have one secret screw right here, which is why that back plate isn't quite coming off yet. It's always about order of operations on these things, just like doing car mechanics. So I do a lot of tool reviews. I suppose it makes sense I like taking apart cameras and stuff, just because that's a similar kind of deal and process. Really make sure that there isn't any other screws that are hiding. Now this just has a beep speaker. This doesn't, even though this can take video, it doesn't actually have a speaker good enough to listen to that audio. And then there's our backup plate. Our array of buttons, all with capped on tape on them. And then we'll pull off the screen here. We got a screw here. It does seem one of the more replaceable parts universally, as far as all these cameras are concerned, would be the screen. It would seem that they can get damaged, and so they can be replaced pretty easily. I don't think you can really get parts for them. Pop that out. Interestingly enough, we're going to have to flip that up, finish unscrewing this shielding plate. And there's always shielding plates behind the screens, and it must be because of the signaling to the screen must generate some type of interference, and so there's always a little shielding plate. It may either be that or the LED backlight that's generating the interference, which I find strange because the screens always have metal plates on them already. Kind of odd about this camera. I guess they're all, well, actually not. Many of them, the frame of the camera is this front part, and I guess some of them are like this Olympus here, where it's a mid-frame kind of deal. There we go. That was stuck on with some tape. Now we can get access to the little flip lever and pop out the screen. This doesn't actually have a separate cable for the backlight. Usually they have, or many have, two ribbon cables. This has a single ribbon cable, but of course we have two wires here for the backlight. Other than that, we'll see what kind of screws we have for the motherboard here. We have another piece of tape prevent this ribbon cable from chafing, and this ribbon cable is for that. I'll just pull this out. Many times you can just yank these cables out and then figure out how to, like on this one, it doesn't flip up. Many of them flip up. On this case, whoop, I assume it's one that slides forward. Look, I actually found that little piece. We do have a screw for the motherboard here. A very shallow screw, who knows what that's connecting to. This is the capacitor for the flash. You always want to be careful because those things are around 300 volts. And so if you've had the even if you're not using the flash, many of these cameras will still charge up that capacitor. So if you're testing this and actually trying to repair it, and you've had it on recently, make sure to get plenty of time for that capacitor to discharge, because it will shock the beans out of you. They're high voltage because the flash is a strobe light. It's a little xenon tube, so it needs a high voltage to send a little arc across. Another little screw right here. This is definitely a cheap Olympus camera. And I tear these apart. I kind of repeat this in all these videos. Just because cell phone cameras, especially in the last few years, have gotten so good, it's pretty much made these pocket cameras obsolete. Of course, these truly aren't obsolete because they have more space, so they have much better lenses, and they have optical zooms. Cell phones with optical zooms are actually a separate camera assembly with a fixed zoom, and then they do, I mean, I have a Galaxy S20 Ultra, and it uses it has 3 cameras. One's a zoom, but what it's doing is they're each a wide angle, a standard, and a regular or a wide angle, the regular and the zoom camera, excuse me. And then as you zoom in from wide angle, it will actually do digital zoom. You can see it transition from one camera lens to the next one. When you get up, start zooming in at 3.9 times, it's just a digital zoom on the normal lens, and then as soon as you hit 4 times, you'll see the image change as it swaps the camera to the zoom camera. This definitely isn't really made for serviceability because we have all sorts of soldered wires on this, which is of course a disappointment, but it is what I was expecting out of this Olympus. I mean, it is a cheap camera. Now let's see if we can't get this thing to pop out of here. Yeah, I definitely got rid of all the screws. Do a little bit of prying work here. Oh, I see, we've got the port. There we go. A couple of thick wires there for the battery. There we go, pop those off. Easy as peasy as pie. Well, not quite easy as pie, but pretty easy. Snap this board out of there. Pop that ribbon cable out. And I'll just rip these wires out of there. And so there's our piezo speaker. I mean, it's just a beep speaker. If they are trying to play video audio through that, it will be basically indiscernible. Of course, the memory backup battery is soldered. It was never meant to be replaced. Various chips for controlling the screen and controlling the, the memory card and handling the USB interface. But this has been a standard between all these cameras. Is we have a processor, we have like RAM to temporarily hold the image until it writes it to the memory card, and then we have like a firmware chip. Actually, this Hynix chip is probably the RAM, or actually they're both Hynix. So one of these is RAM, one of these is the firmware or software chip. This is probably the RAM chip, and then this is the processor, Novatech. And not a lot else to really say about that. Nothing too special there. Let's go ahead and pop the rest of these screws out and get this lens assembly out. The entire power supply for the flash is there. Definitely a cheap camera. Like the Panasonic, once again, use the name brand Rubicon capacitor. This is a no-name PCF. It is rated photo flash, 310 volts, 85 microfarads. I'll probably keep this one. At least they put some silicone on the wires. And now we're getting down to the last little bit, which is the lens assembly. And as I mentioned in pretty much all these cameras, it seems that the CCD array here, in which I've torn the... Oh wow, I didn't realize that. So those holes were for. So the lens assembly needed to come out with the motherboard. I've never seen this, but the CCD array... Oh, I see. The holes were for remove the plate. The CCD array was soldered to the motherboard. I've never seen one that... This is the first one so cheap that the CCD array was soldered to the motherboard itself. Extra no serviceability. Pull out the 3 little screws on the little bracket and look at the little electronic eyeball. It's not an eyeball, but the little electronic sensor. And there's our little 12 megapixel sensor. Super small, QR code for factory scanning. Not a lot else going on there. And I suppose, oh, that's interesting. This is some type of filter or part of the lens that just fell out. Never really had that happen before. We of course have two motors here, one to control opening, telescoping the lens and controlling the zoom, and there's a few sensors for that. And then a step motor, which is what deals with the autofocus. So we'll pull off these two screws so we can look at the little gear train that expands and contracts the lens. Oh, wow, we had a spring in there that I wasn't expecting. As with many cameras, whenever there's a spring inside these things, it is super microscopic. I keep these, they can come in handy in certain situations. And then there's the little gear train that just allows, since the motor has to be offset and needs to run a gear against the outside edge of the lens, they have to use this whole little gear set to transfer it. And then they have just like a little sensor to detect when the lens is retracted. Some of these also have a pulse encoder to determine essentially how far it's moving. The reason that the autofocus uses a step motor is because step motors, you can pulse them and they'll move a very specific amount. And so when it's trying to focus, it says, okay, I'm really out of focus, move 3 steps, I'm almost focused, moved 1 step. And so that, and then with the zoom, it just uses a regular DC motor. Pull that cover off, and here's our lens assembly. Here's something I'm not quite understanding, is why we have a second little lens there. That may be something where when it expands, that swings down, which is actually really what I'm expecting here. I'm just trying to figure out how to get this opened up. This one has some extra complication because actually this gear train over here, it's used, this autofocus step motor actually goes through a gear train. The gear train for the extending the lens is right here. Whoop, something just fell out. This was a long gear, so I'm supposing, like in this case, we can just pop this out. And that was true. This little, when it folds up, this little lens pushes upwards, and then when it starts to telescope out or unfold, then this lens actually flips downwards. So that's an interesting little space-saving feature. This is the actual moving lens for the focus mechanism. And we'll see if we can't magically figure out how to there we go. So when it closes all the way, there's a little lens shutter, and then that's what it does. It just unfolds, and when it zooms, it just moves that lens back and forth. So I'm trying to, well, first, I don't think there's any more screws that I'm missing here. Kind of want to take a look at the gear train for there we go. Well, it fell apart on me. But we have a few little gears in there which are related to this. This motor has a worm drive, then it has a chain of gears which go and eventually interface with this long gear, which is what's actually driving the lens. In my Panasonic video, it actually had like 4 gears in there to make it all happen. Not a lot else in here besides the focus motor. Like the Kodak, I actually had to break it. It was permanently installed. This we can pop out this way. The shutter is usually installed in here. This secondary section there we go. Now we can get that apart, or at least turned down, I should say. We'll just pry this apart, this next ring, and or pry it off, I should say. And they all just run in those tracks. Interestingly enough, we have like another little metal clip here. And I wonder if this is what's kind of holding this apart or together so that I can get at the shutter. Always try to get it at least down to the shutter in these things. And that little clip indeed was holding this together. The final lens is always a magnifying glass, so sometimes you can use these as a loop. Then I thought in here was the shutter, but obviously I have misconstrued where the shutter is. I wonder if the shutter's in this. Oh yes, the shutter's right in this section. A couple little electromagnets, and it moves just a couple little levers which flip some super thin and obviously very dark or very black little sheets of plastic. They're super light. They're plastic so they can be super lightweight so that they can open and close super quickly. And I don't know exactly what's preventing. There we go. It's another tiny spring. That was the spring that was actuating this, the folding or lens. And then the shutter is all inside this weird little assembly. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it apart or not. One of the world's most microscopic screws. I shouldn't say that, they're certainly tiny screws, but cameras have super tiny screws, especially when it comes to the shutter mechanism. A little clip, and we will be able to get this apart. Whoop. Anyway, I just lost one of the, but here's the little shutter leaves. Dump those out. Get that out. And then in here what we have is we have just little electromagnets. And they're just moving tiny little arms. You can see it there. And so when it triggers the shutter, we have two electromagnets, and it just flips the little pieces of plastic closed and then back open again. Anyway, the end of another camera teardown. This time the Olympus X-42. I really appreciate everybody who's been watching and subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Till next time, Catus Maximus out.